There is a moment right before something ends when you do not know it is ending. You wake up and go through the same motions you went through yesterday, carrying the same tired hopes, the same quiet worries, and yet somewhere underneath the surface of your ordinary day, something has already begun to shift. A door is closing. A friendship is cooling. A job is unraveling. A version of yourself that you spent years building with your own hands is quietly being taken apart, piece by piece, and you have been calling it a crisis when it might actually be a construction site. If you are watching this today, there is a very real chance that this is exactly what is happening to you right now. And before this video ends, you're going to understand why. C.S. Lewis knew this feeling better than almost anyone who ever picked up a pen. He was not a man who theorized about pain from a safe distance. He lost his mother when he was a boy, watched comfort and stability disappear from his childhood home almost overnight, and spent decades wrestling with doubt before he ever wrote a single word about God. Later in life, after he had finally built something like happiness with his wife, he lost her too, and he wrote his way through that grief in real time, refusing to pretend that faith made the pain smaller. That is what makes his words about seasons so different from the version you hear printed on a greeting card. He is not telling you that everything happens for a reason from a place of comfort. He is telling you from the middle of the wreckage because he lived there. And this is the part that most people miss when their life starts falling apart. They assume that because something is being removed, God has stepped back. They assume that the silence means abandonment, that the closed door means failure, that the ending means punishment. But there is an old idea, older than Lewis, older than most of what we call modern faith, that says the opposite. It says that removal is often the first sign that something is about to be built. Before a builder can raise a new structure, the old one has to come down. Before a field can grow a new crop, the old one has to be cleared. Before a season can change, the one before, it has to end completely. Not partially, not gently, but completely. Stay with me here, because this next part is the piece that changes everything. And if you skip it, you're going to keep repeating the same season for years without understanding why. Lewis wrote about God as a builder who is not satisfied with small repairs. He described it like a house. If God were only fixing a cottage, he might patch a leaking roof, repair a crack in the wall, replace a broken window and call it finished. That kind of God would only touch the parts of your life that are visibly broken. But Lewis believed God is not building a cottage. He is building a palace. And you cannot renovate a cottage into a palace with small repairs. You have to knock down walls that were never meant to hold up something that large. You have to rip out foundations that were fine for a small house but would collapse under something greater. That is why the process feels violent sometimes. It is not because God is cruel. It is because the plan is bigger than the structure you already have, and the structure has to change to hold it. Think about what that means for your life right now. That relationship that ended and left you confused, maybe it was not built to survive into your next season. That job that let you go or that you finally had to leave, maybe it was a cottage-sized role in a life that is being expanded into something it cannot contain. That version of yourself, the one who needed everyone's approval, the one who stayed quiet to keep the peace, the one who settled because leaving felt too frightening. Maybe that version of you was never meant to walk into what is coming next. Something has to be removed before something else can be added. That is not cruelty. That is construction. There is a passage in the old writings, the kind Lewis studied for most of his academic life, about a vine and its branches. It says that every branch that bears fruit gets pruned so that it can bear even more fruit. Read that again slowly. It does not say the dead branches get cut off, while the healthy ones are left alone. It says the ones that are already bearing fruit, the good parts, the parts that are working, those get cut back too. That is the part nobody wants to hear. Sometimes what God is removing from your life is not the bad thing. It is the good thing that has become too small for where you are going. I need you to really sit with that for a second, because most people watching this are waiting for God to remove the bad stuff, the toxic relationship, the dead-end job, the fear, the old habits. And he will, but some of you are also losing good things right now. And that confusion is exactly why you need to keep watching. Because there is a difference between loss and pruning. And once you understand that difference, this season is going to make a lot more sense. Loss takes something away and leaves nothing behind but absence. Pruning takes something away so that more can grow in its place. The gardener does not cut a branch because he hates the plant. He cuts it because he has already seen what that plant is capable of, and he refuses to let it settle for less. If you have ever wondered why a season that started with so much promise suddenly turned into a season of subtraction, this might be your answer. You are not being punished. You are being pruned by someone who already sees the harvest you cannot see yet. Lewis had a phrase for pain that has stuck with people for almost a century. He called it God's megaphone. Not because pain is good in itself, but because pain has a way of getting our attention when nothing else will. He argued that we can ignore pleasure, that we can build entire lives around comfort and distraction, and never once stop to ask the deeper questions. But pain does not let us look away. It shouts, it interrupts, it forces a kind of honesty that comfort never demands. If your life feels loud right now, if it feels like everything is shouting for your attention at once, that might not be chaos. That might be an invitation to finally listen to something you have been avoiding for years. Here's what most people do instead of listening. They try to rebuild the old cottage as fast as possible. The relationship ends, and within weeks they are chasing a replacement that looks almost identical just to feel normal again. The job disappears, and instead of asking what kind of work they actually want to spend their life doing, they scramble to find anything that pays the same amount, doing the same thing, under a different name. The old identity gets shaken, and instead of sitting in the discomfort long enough to discover who they are becoming, they grab the nearest label and put it back on just to stop the unfamiliar feeling of not knowing. And every single time they do this, they delay the very thing they have been praying for. This is usually where people turn the video off, because this is where it stops being comforting and starts being convicting. But if you have made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person this message is for. So let us keep going, because here is the uncomfortable truth. You cannot walk into your next season carrying the furniture from the last one. You cannot expect a palace-sized calling to fit inside a cottage-sized identity. If God is truly clearing space in your life right now, then the fastest way to sabotage that work is to fill the empty rooms back up with the same old furniture the moment it starts to feel too quiet. Silence is not always a sign that God has left. Sometimes silence is the sound of a room being emptied on purpose, so that something new has somewhere to go. Lewis wrote something in one of his later books, imagining people who were offered a kind of paradise, but who could not let go of the small, familiar miseries of their old lives long enough to walk into something greater. They were given the chance to leave their chains behind, and some of them picked the chains back up because the chains were familiar, and familiar felt safer than free. That is not only a story about the afterlife, that is a story about every person who stays in a dead relationship, a dead career, a dead version of themselves, because letting go of the familiar feels more frightening than staying inside the pain they already know how to survive. So let me ask you something, and I want you to actually sit with this instead of scrolling past it in your mind. What are you still holding on to, that God has already released you from? What relationship? What title? What old wound? What grudge? What fear are you still gripping with both hands, even though the door has clearly been opened for you to walk away? Because as long as your hands are full of the old thing, they cannot receive the new thing. God rarely pours into closed fists. Now, before you assume this is just another motivational message about letting go and moving on, I want to show you something Lewis understood about timing that most people completely misunderstand. And it is the reason so many people quietly abandon their faith right in the middle of their own breakthrough. In his stories about a frozen magical land, winter does not end the moment someone wishes it would. The land is trapped under snow for what feels like forever, always winter, and never Christmas. And the characters inside that world have no idea when it is going to change. They only know something has shifted the moment they notice small, almost invisible signs. A trickle of water where there used to be solid ice. Flowers pushing up through snow that should have buried them completely. The signs of spring do not arrive with an announcement. They arrive quietly underneath a landscape that still looks exactly like winter to anyone who is not paying close attention. That is what your next season looks like right now. From where you are standing, it might still look like winter. It might still feel cold, still feel frozen, still feel like nothing is growing. But underneath the frozen surface of your circumstances, Something is already beginning to move.
The very fact that old things are being removed from your life is one of those small, easy-to-miss signs. Endings are not always proof that winter is getting worse. Sometimes endings are the first sign that the thaw has already begun, and you simply have not learned to recognize it yet. This is why patience matters so much more than people give it credit for. Not passive waiting, where you just sit still and hope things improve on their own, but active patience, the kind where you keep showing up, keep doing the next right thing, keep clearing out what needs to be cleared, even while the landscape still looks unchanged. Nobody in that frozen story made spring arrive faster by panicking. They kept moving forward through the snow, and the season changed around them while they were still walking. I want to pause here and say something important, because I know some of you watching this are not just going through an inconvenient season. Some of you are in real pain. Some of you have lost something you do not even know how to talk about yet. So let us slow down for a moment before we go any further. Lewis did not write about grief as an outside observer. When his wife died, he wrote a small, raw book, almost like a private journal, describing what grief actually felt like from inside it. He admitted that grief did not feel like the calm, dignified sadness people describe in stories. It felt more like fear, a constant, low hum of dread sitting underneath everything, even the ordinary moments, even the moments that should have felt normal. He admitted that for a while. He wondered if God had simply vanished the moment he needed him the most, that when he turned to God in his greatest need, he found what felt like a door shut in his face, followed by the sound of something being bolted from the other side. And this matters so much because it means the man whose ideas we are studying right now did not arrive at hope by skipping over despair. He walked straight through it. He did not pretend the silence did not hurt. He did not perform a peace. He did not actually feel. He let himself feel abandoned before he ever felt comforted again. And it was only by going through that honest darkness that he eventually found his way to a steadier kind of faith on the other side. If you're in that place right now, where God feels distant and the silence feels like rejection instead of preparation, you are not failing at faith. You are walking the same road Lewis walked. And there is a version of you on the other side of this season who is going to look back and understand exactly why this part was necessary. He came to realize something important after the worst of the grief had passed. He said that his previous image of God, the comfortable one, the one built more out of his own imagination and wishful thinking than out of anything real, had to be knocked down before he could know the real thing. He compared it to a house of cards. The house of cards was never God. It was only his idea of God, and when it collapsed, it felt exactly like God himself had disappeared. But what had actually happened was that a false, undersized version of God had been cleared away to make room for something true. This might be exactly what is happening in your life right now, and I promise you, once you see it this way, you will never look at this season the same way again. Maybe what is collapsing in your life is not your faith. Maybe it is your idea of what your life was supposed to look like by now. Maybe it is your idea of who was supposed to stay. Maybe it is your idea of what success was supposed to feel like once you finally reached it. Those ideas were never God. They were a house of cards, built out of assumptions and comparisons and other people's timelines. And when they fall down, it can feel exactly like abandonment. But it is not abandonment. It is demolition. And demolition always happens before construction, never after. So what does all of this actually mean for you, practically, today, in this exact season you are living in right now? It means the first step is not to fight to keep the old structure standing. Stop trying to save what has already served its purpose. Stop trying to convince a person to stay who has already shown you they are leaving. Stop trying to force an old version of your career back to life when every sign points towards something new. The energy you spend trying to preserve what is ending is energy you are not spending preparing for what is coming. The second step is to stop interpreting silence as absence. This is one of the hardest habits to break because silence genuinely feels like abandonment when you are in the middle of it. But remember, spring does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, underneath a landscape that still looks like winter. If you cannot feel God doing something right now, that does not mean nothing is happening. It might simply mean the work is happening underneath the surface, in places you cannot see yet. The way roots grow before anything visible ever breaks through the soil.
There is one more thing Lewis understood, something that ties every piece of this together, and it is easily the most important part of this entire message, so do not check out now. He talked often about desire, that deep, restless ache inside every person for something more, something this world never seems to fully satisfy. He argued that if we find within ourselves a desire that nothing in this world can fulfill, the most reasonable explanation is that we were made for another world. That ache you feel, the one you have tried to numb with distractions, relationships, achievements, and constant motion, that ache is not a flaw in you. It is evidence. It is proof that you were built for more than the cottage you have been living in. The very discomfort you feel in this current season, the restlessness, the sense that something more is supposed to happen, is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It is a sign that you were designed for the palace, not the cottage. And part of you has always known it. This is why the removal season is so disorienting. It is not just clearing out a relationship or a job. It is clearing out an entire identity that was built around cottage-sized dreams, so that a palace-sized calling finally has room to exist. You were never meant to spend your whole life renovating the same small rooms. You were meant to walk into space you have not seen yet, rooms that have not been built yet, a version of your life that could not exist until the old one was cleared away first. And here is the part that should give you real peace instead of more anxiety about all of this. You do not have to build the palace yourself. You are not the architect here. You are not even the contractor. Your job is not to figure out exactly what the next season looks like, force it into existence through sheer effort, and control every outcome along the way. Your job is far simpler than that, and honestly, far more freeing. Your job is to stop clinging to the rubble, keep showing up with an open, willing heart, and trust the one who is actually doing the building. Before we get to how this actually plays out day to day, I want to bring this back to something very real. Because principles are easy to accept in theory and much harder to live out when your own life is the one falling apart. Picture someone who spent 10 years building a business from nothing. Every ounce of their identity was wrapped up in that name on the door, that title on the business card, that version of success they had been chasing since they were young. And then, through no clear fault of their own, it collapses. Maybe the market shifted. Maybe a partner betrayed them. Maybe it simply ran its course. From the outside, it looks like failure. It feels from the inside like the ground opening up beneath their feet. But years later, looking back, that same person often says the same thing. The collapse was the beginning of the version of their life that actually mattered. The thing they thought was the whole point of their existence turned out to be the cottage, and the collapse, as devastating as it felt at the time, was the demolition that made room for the palace they could not have imagined back then. Or picture someone who spent years in a relationship that looked, from the outside, like exactly what they were supposed to want, and then it ends. Not because either person did anything monstrous, but simply because it was never built to survive the next chapter of who they were becoming. The grief is real, the confusion is real, but so often, years down the road, the same story repeats itself. The ending that felt like the worst thing that ever happened to them becomes, in hindsight, the exact hinge point where their real life finally began. You are living inside your own version of that story right now. And you simply have not reached the part yet where you can see it clearly. That is the nature of seasons. You almost never recognize them while you are inside them. You only recognize them in hindsight. Once the next season has fully arrived, and you can finally look back and see the shape of what was actually happening the whole time. So let us talk about what you actually do with all of this, right now. Today, because understanding a truth without applying it will not change a single thing about your life. First, name what is being removed. Do not avoid it. Do not distract yourself from it. Sit down, even just in your own mind, and be honest about what has ended, what is ending, and what you suspect is about to end. Naming it takes away some of its power to frighten you, because vague dread is always scarier than a clearly named loss. Second, ask yourself the harder question underneath that one. Was this thing actually part of my calling, or was it part of the cottage? Some things that are ending were never meant to be permanent. They were meant to teach you something, shape you in some way, and then step aside once their purpose was complete. You do not have to grieve every ending as if it were a tragedy. Some endings are graduations. Third, resist the urge to rebuild too quickly. Give yourself permission to sit in the unfinished, uncomfortable, in-between space for a while. This is where most people fail, not because they lack faith, but because they cannot tolerate uncertainty, so they rush to fill it with anything familiar, even if it is not what they actually need. The in-between season is uncomfortable by design. It is supposed to feel unfinished. That discomfort is doing something in you that comfort never could. Fourth, watch for the small signs. The trickle of water under the ice, the flower pushing up through snow that should have buried it. These signs rarely look dramatic. They look like a small shift in how you feel about something that used to devastate you. They look like an unexpected door opening in a completely different direction than the one you were staring at. They look like a stranger saying exactly the words you needed to hear at exactly the right moment. Do not dismiss these as coincidence. Learn to read them as evidence that the season is already turning, even if the temperature has not caught up yet. And finally, the part that ties everything together. The part Lewis spent his entire life trying to put into words in 100 different ways across dozens of books. Trust the builder. More than you trust your own blueprint, you have plans for your life. Everybody does. You have a picture in your mind of how this was supposed to go, who was supposed to stay, what timeline you were supposed to follow, what your life was supposed to look like by this age, this year, this season. And when God starts removing things that do not fit into that picture, it feels like sabotage because it is not following your blueprint. But you were never given the full blueprint. You were only ever shown a few rooms of a house whose complete design you cannot see from where you are standing. The builder can see the whole thing. You can only see the room you are currently standing in, mid-renovation, dust everywhere, walls half torn down, and from inside that room, it is almost impossible not to panic. But renovation always looks like destruction while it is happening. Nobody walks past a construction site in the middle of demolition and assumes a palace is being built. It just looks like rubble, it looks like waste, it looks like something has gone terribly wrong. And then, months or years later, the same site becomes something nobody standing there in the beginning could have predicted. That is where you are right now. If you are the kind of person this message was meant to reach, you are standing in the middle of the dust, and it feels like destruction. And I am telling you, based on everything this man spent a lifetime learning through his own losses, his own doubts, his own grief, and his own slow return to hope, that what feels like destruction right now is very often the earliest, dustiest, most disorienting stage of construction. So do not fight to save the cottage. Do not mistake silence for absence. Do not rebuild too quickly out of fear of the empty rooms. Watch for the small signs under the surface, and trust that the same hands clearing space in your life right now are the hands that are going to fill it with something your old blueprint was never big enough to imagine. There is something else worth saying before we close, because I do not want you walking away from this thinking the removal season is something you simply have to survive with gritted teeth until it is over. It is not only a test of endurance, it is an invitation into a different way of living. Once you stop fighting every ending, as if it were an enemy, you start noticing how much energy you have been spending on resistance. Energy that could instead be spent on becoming the kind of person who is actually ready for what is next. Letting go is not passive. It is one of the most active, deliberate things a person can do, because everything in you will want to hold on. And choosing to open your hands anyway takes a kind of courage that looks quiet from the outside, but is enormous on the inside. Think about the people you admire most, the ones whose lives seem to carry a kind of weight and depth that cannot be faked, almost without exception. They are people who went through a season like the one you are in now and did not run from it. They let the old structure come down. They sat in the dust for longer than they wanted to. They kept showing up without knowing exactly what they were showing up for. And on the other side of that season, they became someone who could hold a bigger life than the one they had before. Because the emptying made room for it. You are being invited into that same process right now, whether it feels like an invitation or not. It is worth remembering, too, that Lewis was not naturally a man of easy faith. He spent years as a committed atheist, convinced that a good God and a suffering world could not both be true. He did not talk himself into belief through wishful thinking. He was, by his own account, dragged toward faith reluctantly, arguing with it the entire way, testing every idea against his considerable intellect before he would accept it.
That matters here, because it means the hope he eventually wrote about was not naive. It was hope that had survived interrogation. It was hope that had been tested against real doubt and real loss, and had not been destroyed by either. So when he says that pain can be purposeful, that endings can be preparation, that seasons genuinely change even when they do not look like it, those are not the words of someone who never questioned it. They are the words of someone who questioned everything and still arrived there anyway. If you take one thing from everything we have walked through together, let it be this. What feels like God removing something from your life is very rarely God taking something away from you out of indifference. Far more often, it is God clearing space, however uncomfortable that clearing feels, so that what comes next actually has room to exist. The cottage had to come down. The dust was never a sign that the plan had failed. It was a sign that the plan had finally begun. Wherever you are in this process right now, whether you're still standing in the wreckage or starting to notice the first small signs that something is shifting underneath the surface, I want you to walk away from this knowing that you are not forgotten. You are not being punished, and you are not too far gone for whatever is coming next. You are simply in the part of the story that always looks the most like an ending, right before it becomes a beginning. If this reached you exactly where you are today, that was not an accident. Sit with it a little longer before you move on to whatever comes next in your day. And if these reflections have helped you see your own season more clearly, stay close, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because your next season is closer than it feels. And I do not want you to miss the moment it finally arrives.